Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about something that's pretty fundamental to how we function as a society, and that's public opinion.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at some excerpts from Walter Lippmann's The Phantom Public,
Right, a classic.
along with Bruno Latour's preface to kind of get us started, and hopefully by the end of this we'll all have a new perspective on how we see ourselves as citizens.
Absolutely. Lippmann's book is, it really gets you thinking about some of the assumptions that we have about how public opinion shapes politics and what it even means to have a public in the first place.
Yeah, and he doesn't really sugarcoat things either, right from the get-go. Lippmann paints this picture of the average citizen kind of feeling lost and overwhelmed when it comes to the complexities of government.
And I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling, right?
Absolutely. I mean, who hasn't felt like that at some point? Just
Right.
drowning in all the information and all the different issues.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that Lippmann wrote this back in 1927.
Wow. Almost 100 years ago.
Yeah, and yet his observations still feel incredibly relevant today.
It's kind of timeless in a way.
Yeah. And to illustrate this feeling of being overwhelmed, he uses this really striking metaphor. He says, the citizen is like a deaf spectator in the back row of a crowded theater.
Okay, I can see where he's going with that. So you're in the theater. You can see that there's something important happening on stage, but you
Yeah.
can only kind of make out what's being said or done.
Precisely. And that's the point he's making. Even though you're present, you're not really participating in a meaningful way. You're kind of just there.
Yeah, and to support this idea, Lippmann doesn't just rely on metaphors, he actually brings in some concrete evidence.
So he did his research.
Yeah, he cites this fascinating study that was done by Merriam and Gosnell at the University of Chicago.
Oh, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they were looking at voter apathy in the 1923 Chicago municipal election.
Okay, so they went out and actually asked people why they weren't voting. What did they find? Well, some people had pretty legitimate reasons. They were sick or out of town or dealing with family emergencies.
Yeah, life happens.
Right. But for a lot of other people, the reasons they gave were more about feeling disconnected from the whole political process.
So they didn't feel like their vote really mattered?
Exactly. They felt like they were too busy, or the polling places were inconvenient, or they just felt like the whole system was rigged against them anyway.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that one before too. It's that sense of, what difference will my one little vote make?
Right. And it's interesting because on the one hand, you can kind of understand where they're coming from, right?
Yeah, especially when you think about how complicated some of these issues are.
But on the other hand, it's kind of alarming for democracy, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're supposed to be a government by the people, right?
Exactly. And that's the irony that Lippmann is highlighting. The theory of democracy says that citizens should be informed and engaged.
But the reality is often very different.
Absolutely. And this gap between the ideal and the real is where his argument about the phantom public comes into play.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of the phantom public. I'm guessing it's not about actual ghosts, right?
No ghosts here.
Okay, good, because I'm not really into ghost stories.
No, this is more about, well, Lippmann is basically saying that this idea of a single, unified, all-knowing public that's driving political decisions is kind of a myth.
So he's saying there's no such thing as the public.
Well, it's not that simple. It's more like there are many different publics,
Okay, so different groups of people who are interested in different issues.
Exactly. Think about it. You might be super passionate about climate change, right?
Yeah.
But do you have the time and energy to become an expert on every single issue facing the country?
Probably not.
And that's true for most of us.
Hmm.
No one can be an expert on everything.
So we kind of specialize based on what we care about the most.
Right. And that's why Lippmann calls it the phantom public. It's this idea that there's this all-powerful entity that's making these rational decisions. But in reality, it's much more messy and fragmented.
So he's not saying people are stupid or apathetic.
No, not at all.
He's just saying that we can't possibly know everything about everything.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Lippmann doesn't actually dismiss the role of public opinion altogether.
Oh, so he thinks it still matters.
He does, but in a more limited way than we might typically think.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So when does public opinion matter according to Lippmann?
He argues that it's during those moments of crisis when the existing rules or systems break down.
So it's not about the everyday running of the government.
Not really. It's more about those big turning points, those moments when we as a society need to decide on a new direction.
So it's like we're all driving along following the rules of the road,
Yeah.
and then suddenly there's a massive accident.
Exactly. The old rules don't apply anymore, and everyone has to figure out a new way forward.
And that's when public opinion becomes really important.
Yes, because it gives us a sense of what the right direction should be.
It's like a gut check.
Yeah, Lippmann compares it to a jury. You might not have all the legal expertise to understand every detail of a case.
But you can still get a sense of whether the overall outcome seems fair.
Right, and that's the role that he sees for public opinion. It's not about micromanaging every decision, but it's about providing that kind of overall sense of what feels right or wrong.
Okay, but if we're not supposed to be policy wonks on every issue, how do we even know what feels right when these big decisions come up?
That's where Lippmann gets really practical. He offers a set of what he calls signals that we can use to cut through all the complexity and figure out who to trust in a political debate.
Oh, so like clues we can look for.
Exactly. And these signals are designed for people who aren't experts on the issue at hand.
Okay, so like most of us, most of the time.
Right.
All right, I'm ready to lay those signals on me.
Well, one of the most important ones is what he calls the test of inquiry. And it's all about whether those involved in a political debate are willing to participate in a neutral third-party investigation of the facts.
So if they're so sure they're right, they should be willing to let an independent group look into it.
Exactly. If someone is dodging scrutiny or trying to control the narrative, that's a big red flag.
Makes sense, but doesn't that require a certain level of trust in the people who are doing the investigating?
That's a great point. And that's where things get even more interesting because Lippmann was very aware of the potential for experts to abuse their power. So he offered some additional signals to help us assess their trustworthiness.
Okay, I like where this is going. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Well, another key signal is what he called the test of consent.
Okay.
And this is all about asking whether those who are proposing a change have made a genuine effort to get agreement from all the people who would be affected by it.
So it's not just about who has the power to make a decision.
No.
It's about whether they've considered the perspectives of everyone involved.
Exactly. And Lippmann stresses that this applies even in situations where you can't get everyone on board, like during a crisis, when you need to act quickly.
So sometimes you have to make a tough call, but you still have a responsibility to explain yourself later.
Right. That sense of accountability is really important for maintaining public trust.
I'm starting to see how these signals can be really helpful, but I'm also wondering, did Lippmann have any critics? People who thought he was being a bit too pessimistic about the public's ability to engage with these complicated issues.
Yes, absolutely. And one of his most prominent critics was the philosopher John Dewey.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Dewey agreed with Lippmann that public opinion has its limitations.
Okay.
But he had a much more optimistic view on how to address those limitations.
So instead of saying democracy is too complicated, let the experts handle it,
Yeah.
he was saying let's find ways to make democracy work better for everyone.
It's exactly. Dewey believed that education and deliberation were key to a healthy democracy. He thought that through education, citizens could develop the skills and knowledge they need to participate in a meaningful way.
So it's about empowering people, not shutting them out.
That's a great way to put it, and we'll dive deeper into Dewey's ideas in the next part of our deep dive because he had some really interesting thoughts about how to make democracy more inclusive and participatory.
Okay, I'm already looking forward to that. But for now, I think this is a good place to take a break and let all of this sink in a bit. What are some of the things that stood out to you so far?
Honestly, the thing that's really sticking with me is how Lippmann challenges this whole idea of the omnicompetent citizen. This expectation that we should all be informed about everything and have a strong opinion on every issue.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
Right, and Lippmann was already recognizing this problem almost 100 years ago.
Yeah, so what does he propose we do about it? I mean, should we just give up and say democracy is too hard?
Not quite. But that's a question we'll explore in our next segment, where we'll look at Lippmann's ideas for how we can still be effective citizens, even if we can't be experts on everything.
Sounds like a plan. I'm ready for part 2.
Me too.
Welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here.
So before the break, we were talking about how Lippmann kind of throws shade at this whole idea of the omnicompetent citizen,
Right, this idea that we should all be experts on everything.
Yeah, like we're supposed to be following every issue, having strong opinions, and voting in every election.
And it's important to remember the context here.
Yeah.
Lippmann was writing in the early 20th century.
Yeah, things were changing pretty rapidly back then.
Exactly. It was a time of massive industrialization, the rise of mass media, global conflicts.
The world was getting a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and Lippmann, being a journalist, he was seeing all of this firsthand.
So he had a front row seat to all the chaos.
Exactly. And he was trying to make sense of how democracy could even function in this new world.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It's like the world was changing faster than our ideas about citizenship could keep up.
Right, and that's why Lippmann's work is still so relevant today. He was grappling with challenges that are even more pronounced now.
Yeah, I mean, the information overload is just insane these days.
Exactly, and Lippmann recognized that expecting every citizen to be a policy expert on every issue was just not realistic.
It's like asking everyone to be a superhero or something.
Right, and that leads him to this idea of the phantom public, this myth that there's this single unified public making all these rational decisions.
But we talked about how he also says that public opinion does matter, just in a more limited way.
Yeah. Can you remind us how that works?
It's like when those big crisis moments happen right when the normal rules don't apply anymore.
That's right. Lippmann argues that public opinion becomes crucial during those times when the system breaks down.
Like when we hit a major roadblock and we need to figure out a new direction.
Exactly. It's not that the public has all the answers.
But it provides a sense of what the right direction should be.
Yeah, Lippmann compares it to a jury.
Okay, I remember that.
You might not understand all the legal complexities of a case, but you can still judge whether the overall outcome seems fair.
Right, so it's more about that gut feeling.
Yeah, it's about providing that sense of what feels right or wrong in a broader sense.
Okay, but if we're not supposed to be policy wonks on every issue, how do we even know what feels right when these big decisions come up?
That's where Lippmann's signals come in, those clues we talked about.
Right, like the test of inquiry, making sure that people are willing to let the facts be investigated.
Exactly, and he offers a few other signals as well, all designed to help us everyday citizens evaluate the trustworthiness of what we're hearing in the public sphere.
Okay, so what else should we be looking for?
Well, another important one is what he calls the test of conformity.
Okay.
And this one is all about looking at whether a lot of people are breaking a particular rule or law.
So if everyone's ignoring it, maybe it's not a good rule.
That's the idea. It could be a sign that the rule is outdated or ineffective or just doesn't make sense anymore.
So it's not about blindly following rules. It's about understanding why the rules are there in the first place.
Exactly, and whether they're still serving their intended purpose.
So we need to be thinking critically about the rules.
Right. Lippmann was a big believer in critical thinking. He didn't want people to just passively accept whatever they were being told.
But that's easier said than done sometimes.
For sure.
I mean, there's so much information out
It
there.
can be really overwhelming.
Exactly. And that's where Lippmann's other signal comes in the one about consent.
Right. The test of consent.
So remind me how that one works.
It's all about asking whether those who are proposing a change have actually made an effort to get buy-in from the people who will be affected by it.
So it's not just about having the power to make a decision.
No, it's about making sure you've heard from everyone who has a stake in the outcome.
And that's important even when you can't get everyone on board, right?
Yes. Lippmann recognizes that in some situations, like during a crisis, you might need to act quickly.
But even then, you still have a responsibility to explain your actions and be held accountable.
Exactly. That accountability is crucial for maintaining public trust.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate Lippmann's framework here, but I know he also had some critics.
Yeah, he did.
People who thought he was being a bit too pessimistic about the whole thing.
Yeah, and one of his most famous critics was a guy named John Dewey.
Oh, yeah, the philosopher.
Yeah, Dewey agreed with Lippmann about the limitations of public opinion,
Yeah.
But he had a very different take on how to approach those limitations.
So Dewey was a bit more optimistic.
Yeah, he believed that instead of trying to reduce public participation, we should be looking for ways to enhance it.
So instead of saying democracy is too complicated, let's just leave it to the experts.
Yeah.
Dewey was saying, let's figure out how to make democracy work better for everyone.
Right. He had this vision of a great community where citizens are actively involved in shaping their world.
It sounds kind of utopian.
It does. But Dewey believed that through education and deliberation, we could actually make it happen.
So it's about empowering people, giving them the tools they need to participate in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And that's where the role of the media becomes really important.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Dewey saw the media as a kind of bridge between the experts and the public.
So helping to translate complex information into something that everyone can understand.
Yeah, that was the idea.
But I don't know how well that's working out these days.
It's definitely a challenge.
I mean, the media landscape is so fragmented now.
It is.
Everyone's got their own sources, their own biases.
Right, and it makes it even harder to figure out what's true and what's not.
It's like we're all living in our own little bubbles.
Yeah, and that brings us back to Lippmann's idea of the phantom public. you know?
Right, this myth of a unified, informed public.
Exactly. It can feel like a pretty distant dream these days.
So, are we doomed to be ruled by whoever controls the information?
Not necessarily.
Hmm.
I think both Lippmann and Dewey offer us some hope here.
Yeah. Okay, I'm listening.
Lippmann gives us those signals, those tools for evaluating information even in a really messy media environment.
Right, so we can still be critical thinkers even when the information's coming from all sides.
Exactly. And Dewey reminds us that democracy isn't a spectator sport.
Oh yeah, we can't just sit on the sidelines.
We need to be active participants. We need to engage in dialogue with others, even those we disagree with.
And be willing to learn from each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole discussion of public opinion so interesting and so relevant, you know?
It's not just some abstract theory.
It's about how we function as a society.
And how we shape the world we want to live in.
Exactly.
I think we've got a lot to think about here, but let's take another break and we'll come back for our final segment where we'll wrap up all these ideas and talk about what they mean for us as citizens.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're back and we've been having this really thought-provoking conversation about public opinion.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've been talking about Lippmann's ideas and how he kind of throws some shade at this idea of the omnicompetent citizen.
Right, this notion that we should all be experts on everything.
Yeah, and how he sees these limitations in how much we can really know and understand.
Especially when it comes to those big complex issues like climate change or artificial intelligence.
Right, exactly. Things that require a lot of specialized knowledge to really grasp.
And we also talked about Dewey's perspective, which was, a bit more optimistic.
Yeah, he believed that people could be more engaged if we just, empowered them with the right tools.
Right. Education and deliberation were key for him.
But even Dewey acknowledged that it's tough,
Yeah, for sure.
to be a truly informed citizen in this day and age.
Right. We're bombarded with information from all sides.
And it's coming at us so fast.
Exactly. So how do we even begin to sort through it all?
Especially when we're not experts ourselves.
Right. It's a real challenge.
So how do we balance this need for expertise with this ideal of democratic decision-making,
It's a tough question.
Like, we're constantly being asked to have opinions on these really complicated issues.
Aye, and to vote on them.
But how can we possibly make informed choices when we don't have the time or the background to become experts ourselves?
Well, I think that's where Lippmann's insights are still so relevant.
Yeah.
He was grappling with this exact problem almost a century ago.
And what did he say?
Well, he argued that experts have this responsibility to communicate their findings in a way that makes sense to the public.
So not talking down to people.
No, but also not being so technical that no one can understand what they're saying.
Right, finding that middle ground.
Exactly. And Dewey also emphasized this idea of making complex information accessible.
So it's a two-way street.
It is. The experts have to do their part, but we as citizens also have to be willing to engage.
To learn and to think critically.
Exactly. It's not enough to just passively absorb information.
We have to question things.
Look at the evidence.
And come to our own conclusions.
Exactly. And that can be tough.
Oh, yeah, it takes effort.
It does. But Lippmann gives us some tools to help us with that, those signals we talked about.
Right, the test of inquiry, the test of consent.
Exactly. Those can be really helpful for evaluating information and deciding who to trust.
Especially when we're not experts ourselves.
Right, and they can help us cut through the noise and make sense of this really complex media landscape.
Because let's face it, the media isn't always doing a great job of helping us understand these issues.
No, sometimes it feels like they're making things more confusing.
Right, with all the different perspectives and biases.
It's hard to know what to believe.
Yeah, so it's easy to see why people feel overwhelmed and disengaged.
And that's where Lippmann's idea of the phantom public becomes so relevant again.
This idea that there's no single unified public.
Yeah, it's more like a bunch of different groups with different interests and priorities.
And all trying to make sense of this chaotic world.
Exactly.
So it can feel pretty bleak sometimes.
It can, but I think both Lippmann and Dewey offer us some hope here.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Lippmann gives us those tools for critical thinking, those signals.
Right, to help us evaluate information.
Exactly. And Dewey reminds us that we can't just sit back and let the experts handle everything.
Yeah, we have to be active participants in our democracy.
Engage in dialogue with each other.
Even when we disagree.
And be willing to learn and grow.
I like that.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Even if we're not experts.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. I really appreciate you joining me for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I think we've all learned a lot about the complexities of public opinion and what it means to be a citizen in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We hope you'll keep these ideas in mind as you navigate the world, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.